Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we're going to begin our second day looking at Unit 4.4, Maritime Empires Established, right, and focusing in on social and a little bit of governance today. Our learning objective is explain the process of state building and expansion among various empires, right, and states in the empire, in the period 1450 to 1750, and we're also looking at continuities and changes to the systems of slavery during that same period. You can look at the standards today and see that this is a pretty dense, topic as far as the College Board is concerned. Obviously, you are looking at and expected to understand, these changes and continuities within the Americas at this time. And then, of course, also take into account the fact that similar changes were taking place in the kind of larger Indian Ocean trade network as well. So, I guess in all reality, we've actually already covered a lot of this in your homeworks. So I'm just going to skim over, a couple of things, that we've already covered just so that we can kind of preview, so an angle that maybe we haven't looked at so far this year. All right, but as far as in class today, we began by talking about Maroon Societies, right? And when you're talking about Maroon Societies, what exactly are we talking about? And I guess we will refer to this a few other, in future class as well. But when you talk about Maroon Societies, what is implied in about a Maroon Society? So your homework tells you that Maroon Societies existed in South America as well as in the Caribbean. So kind of getting away from the Portuguese, Brazilian examples, let's just talk about the Caribbean. What is implied by Maroon Societies within the Caribbean? Obviously there's prominent examples of Maroon Societies in Spanish Cuba, in British Jamaica, as well as in French Saint Domingue, which becomes Haiti. All right. So in class we kind of just talked through, why were there Maroon Societies and how did it happen and whatnot. So I'm just going to cut to the chase here for the video and just say, Maroon Societies take place on some of the larger islands, and there are kind of a couple of preconditions that we see there. One is it happens on the larger islands that are mountainous, so terrain is definitely a part of the Maroon Society story, right? So we see in especially on the island of Hispaniola, right, with Saint Domingue, in what is today Haiti, as well as in Cuba, you see mountainous terrain, right? So the ability to not only kind of have space, but also mountainous space, and this is also true to a lesser degree on Jamaica, is part of the of how they survive. You're not just talking about a few dozen people. You're talking about the establishment of actual societies, and so the ability to defend yourself and to disappear into the terrain and to take on a better equipped military force, is kind of part of that story. So terrain and geography matters, right? And but we're also, when you talk about Maroon Societies, not just talking about a rogue group of individuals, in the mountains. You're talking about actual recognized governance in some cases. Like for example, we know in the case of British Jamaica that attempts were made to eradicate the Maroon Society presence. And we're going to see not only a failure to eliminate those societies, but the British colonial government in Jamaica will actually engage with that government and negotiate treaties. So when you look at like a British colonial Jamaica, you're actually talking about two actual governments, a Maroon government, right? Because the negotiation of a treaty means recognition of government. It's an inherent part of of negotiations is you are recognizing the other side, right, for treaty purposes, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon, just not because of the fact that it's an example of resistance to the institution of slavery, but we also see formal recognition by colonial authorities in some cases. And there's also the fact that the Haitian Revolution in 1791 begins at a Vundoon ceremony within a Maroon society. And of course, you talked about the syncretic cultural application that we looked at last week. Santiara, is a Maroon Society phenomenon from Cuba, and Candomblé is a Maroon phenomenon from Brazil. Right. So so these also give rise to cultural syncretism. They give them the space, that they will develop. Right. Vundoon is a Maroon Society from Saint Domingue, from Haiti, modern day Haiti. All right. All right. So they give that space required for cultural syncretism to be able to flourish. All right. So what we're getting into here when you're talking about Maroon societies, you're talking about kind of deep into that evolution of this time frame. And so yesterday we were talking about encomienda, changing into repartimento and the hacienda system. So you're really kind of getting into the 1600s and the 1700s before you get that critical mass of population required for the development of such phenomenon. All right. So and we've talked about this before. And I just want to kind of mention one other thing is after you get by the 1600s, you were talking about an intensification and a rise in the level of the Atlantic slave trade. And this is also a time in which that Portuguese monopoly on the Atlantic slave trade is broken. And of course, a large part of that has to do with these companies, right? And I guess this is previewing an assignment you're gonna get is you're about to do a homework on the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. So these are the rise of the joint stock corporations. And we'd watch this video that kind of looks at the kind of intensification of the slave trade over time. All right. So when we see the Portuguese monopolies being broken, it is these joint stock companies which will break that monopoly, and then be part of that intensification of the Atlantic slave trade network. And and of course, this is this is part of the history of the joint stock companies, is that they were involved in and they were profiting from the Middle Passage leg of the Atlantic slave trade system. Right. So it is part of that kind of early history. That is that Middle Passage leg, right, being performed by these groups. And of course, we see the French as well taking part in this, supplying Saint Domingue or Haiti and their other West Indies colonies. All right. All right. So, when you kind of get into this, there's all kinds of implications, of the interaction that is taking place. We have already, we talked last week about Santiara and Candomblé. You could, talk about other examples of syncretism, such as Our Lady of Guadalupe. So there's a couple of different kind of angles you could kind of look at this with. And because of the complexity that the College Board also wants you to kind of look at the Indian Ocean, but this is stuff that we talked about in Unit 3 already, and we talked about the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, and we talked about the Sokoku system, this closed society or law country system, and the implications with Unit 3.3 on Christianity. So we've already kind of talked about that to a degree, but because we are about to get into, the rise of joint stock companies, it's probably a good idea to at least kind of, reinforce this idea that the Tokugawa shogunate was not a closed country per se. They simply heavily restricted who had access to that country. So the Chinese were allowed to access Japan via trade from places like Nagasaki, right? And Europeans were as well, but only specific Europeans, right? So specifically the Dutch, right? The DOC, the Dutch East India Company, right? Was allowed to, to interact with Japan during this time. And of course, European knowledge does come into Japan. So this is where that term Dutch studies comes from. It's just this is where this is how that information was diffused into Japan. So it's not as if that they were completely isolated, right? It was just highly restricted who could come and then who could access that knowledge. So that being said, right? There's kind of more previewing future topics than anything. But I want to kind of continue what we were talking about with yesterday, right? And looking at once you kind of get into the mid 1600s and the Bourbon reforms and the establishment of the hacienda system, once you kind of get into that, you're talking about growing populations and increasing syncretism taking place, and of course, part of that interconnectedness that we see is going to have results on the kind of rise of the casta system. So I do want to just talk about the casta system for a moment. So yesterday we talked about, in the last video we talked about this, just kind of as an introducer, to this, and we made it, I think, to about here, right? So just to kind of run through this. The castas are a hierarchical system of race classifications created by the Spanish elites in Latin America, right? So what do you really need to know about this? You need to understand that there is this system that is known as the castas, that there is a racial system which does classify individuals into different racial categories, and you should be aware of some of the primary classifications. This is also a good time to simply say that these are vocabulary concepts that exist in a time and a place. In that time and place, for usage within common vernacular is not in 2021 in the United States, right? So these are terms that were used in Latin American history. Saint Domingue, French, what is today Haiti, Spanish, Latin America, Portuguese, Brazil, right? And you need to be able to recognize them for their historical context, but they need to be, you need to remember that they need to remain within a historical context, right? So not, these are not words that are generally acceptable in 2021 for common usage. All right. So that being said, right? So we have basic classifications for mixed racial children, right? So the offspring of mixed racial parents. So mestizos is a general categorization, right? So the question is what do you have to know about this system? And so we kind of started looking at this yesterday, and how much like the Varna system really is it, right? So there's a claim that we have here. There's a claim that the casta system is a fixed system of racial hierarchy which has social, economic, and legal implications. And, peninsulares being on the top of that fixed system of racial hierarchies, and at the bottom are enslaved Africans. All right. Now, it's, at least at the kind of post encomienda era. All right. So on the bottom of this, Native Americans, after after encomienda is wraps up, by the time you get into the repartimiento, and especially during the hacienda, Native Americans would have had special rights, right? So so this is already depicting a historical inaccuracy, simply based on that. So what is this system? We know what the claim is. So what is it? All right. So we have all kinds of examples of these. These are called casta paintings, and in these casta paintings, you can probably not read that or not, but you can see here we have a picture of a man, and it says Español, right? So this is a Spanish man, and then it says India, right? So this is a Native American woman, and then we see the child, a painting of a child, and we have an identification of a racial categorization for that, right? So mestiza, right? So assuming that's a girl there. All right. All right. So we have kind of, informative paintings, identifying racial categories of the father, the mother, and then what the title of that child would be with that racial categorization. Right? And as we can see here, it becomes increasingly complex. Kind of as you go on here. So mestizo, right? It tells you this is what the term is: the father and the mother, all right, and degree of whiteness, all right, and you can kind of see it gets pretty complex, going beyond 100 different classifications, all right. And of course, we see this in Spain, Spanish colonies. We see this in the French colonies in the West Indies, right, in the Caribbean. We also see this, used by the Portuguese in Brazil. All right. So what do you need to know? You need to know that this is a system that did exist. That they do have Costa paintings, and they do have names associated with degrees of whiteness. All right, so it is good to be aware of that, and of course, you should at least know the basics. You should be able to identify a couple of the costas. Like you should be able to kind of figure out that based on this system, if a peninsulare and a peninsulare had a child in Latin America, what would that child classification be? The answer is Creoles, all right, because only peninsulares are only born on the Iberian Peninsula. That's what we talked about last video. All right, but someone born right, born of European descent in the Americas, marries and has children with another individual, right? Their child would also be a Creole. So that is a group that expands over time, right? And by the time you get into the 1800s, they would make up over 20% of the Spanish Latin American population, right? So this is a growing group. Whereas, Peninsularis is a first generation immigrant group. All right. And of course, we see, be able to identify this would be as mulatto, be able to identify this as mestizo. Right. So as long as you can do that, you kind of get the idea. All right. The issue here, right, is, once you kind of get beyond that, what do you need to know? So first off, there's kind of some misnomers about how much rights Native Americans had within colonial Spanish Latin America, right? So we have these notions of the Republic de Indios, right, Native American communities overseen by priests, right, and royal representatives, and then you had the Republic of Españoles, right, so Spaniards and their African slaves. There are different legal applications depending upon kind of where you're talking about, whether you're talking about in Cuba or whether you're talking about in Mexico. And of course, then whether you're talking about, when you're actually talking about the Republic de Indios, you're really talking about Central America, right, at that point. So it's pretty complicated though, right? Once you kind of get, down into these kinds of terms. So this kind of begs the question about what is race and what is ethnicity. So not to even get too kind of complicated with this, but what does it even mean to be Spanish? All right. Well, what does it mean to be Spanish? Spanish, when you kind of look at Spanish history, let's just kind of go back 2,000 years. Spain was ruled over by Italians, by the Roman Empire, and then about 1,600 years ago, Spain would have been overrun by Central and East Asian Germanic groups. Of course, before the Romans, they were overrun by North African groups, right? Carthage, right? And but anyway, you kind of run down the line a little after the Germanic groups come through. Then you have Arabs will then take over the Iberian Peninsula, and then they will rule for about 300 years, and then you'll have your North African Berber groups, then ruling for a couple of hundred years. So what does it mean to be, racially, to be Spanish? This is a very complicated issue, right? And of course, once you get by, the initial, then it becomes kind of even more complex, right? So when you talk about the colonial casta system, this is something that was popularized in the 40s when I came through school, probably in the early, late 80s and early 90s. And when I went through my university studies, the general thought behind this is that it was a fixed system of racial hierarchy which had social, economic, and legal implications. And then, for my first decade teaching, that's what it was. So, the thought process was that there was in colonial Latin America, that there was very real barriers that existed, which prohibited economic activity, within certain groups, right? So someone from a mestizo group could not do the same kind of economic jobs and tasks and activities as somebody who was a criollos, and that the laws applied differently, right, depending upon which group they were in. Right? That's kind of the general process. However, a few years ago, I was listening to a podcast on 15-minute history. It's a podcast produced by the University of Texas in Austin, where they look at a wide range of historical topics, and of course this claim was called into question. So now we have some kind of alternative thoughts here. So I'm just going to read you, and I just pulled this off from Wikipedia. I didn't, so just kind of let you know what my source is here. All right. So, but what we see here is the system of casta is now, maybe it was present stronger in some places than others, right? So there are assertions made that the casta system really wasn't that applicable in places like the Andes, right? So you had very, very little mention to casta ever in their history. And then in places like Mexico, where of course most of these paintings come from, what was it, right? So that we have this kind of assertion being made, right, after after researching published records, that no fixed system of classification for individuals existed, right? Based on research. There's considerable fluidity in society, with same individuals being identified by different categories simultaneously or over time. Individuals self-identified by particular terms, often to shift their status from one category to another to their advantage. For example, both mestizo and Spaniards were exempt from tribute obligations, but both were equally subjected to the Inquisition. Indios, right, Native Americans, on the other hand, paid tribute, yet were exempt from the Inquisition. In certain cases, mestizo might try to pass for an Indio to escape the Inquisition. An Indio might try to pass as a mestizo to escape tribute obligation. All right, so what does this mean? This means once you get by, what's being asserted here. Once you get by, I guess European descent or Native American descent or of African descent. Once you get by that, even at this level of racial categorization, you will have people choosing to identify as one group or another for their own benefit, right? Out of their own self-interest. So you could self-identify as whatever race you wanted for a perceived benefit, right? That may exist. All right. So I guess in those lines, maybe that's something that makes the casta system even more understandable by today's youth, right? So maybe it wasn't as rigid and fixed as one might have previously thought. So this is something where it's kind of a good example of how claims that are made by historians, right? They are made, and evidence is used to support that, and then of course people will then contradict said claims. So right, so this is kind of a good example of that, where you can use the evidence to support, right, that assertion one way or another. Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Just as a student of history. All right, so in class we wrapped up by doing an SAQ. All right, by doing an SAQ. So here we have an example of a casta painting. This was painted in Mexico in 1763. And what we have here is the Español. Right? We have a Spanish, all right, Spanish man, right, y mulata, right, so a mixed racial descent woman, and their child, right, or children, right, is Morsko. Right, so that's what we're seeing in this painting, right? And our question is this: explain one historical development that led to, right? That led to being the key word. Explain one historical development that led to the formation of mixed race families in colonial Spanish America, as depicted in the image above. What you're really being asked to do with this question is to contextualize. Right? You're being asked to contextualize what led to. Right? What led to the what led to the formation of mixed race families in colonial Spanish America, as depicted in this area above? Keep in mind that this is an explain question, right? And as an explain question, it is always recommended that you use that ACE system. So 3-sentence minimum, right? 3-sentence minimum, where you make an assertion, right? Answering the question, right? Make an assertion or a claim, right? You cite evidence, right? Give some specific name or title for a historical process, and then lastly, you explain, right? Explain how the evidence supports the assertion. Right? So 3-sentence minimum, 3-sentence maximum. All right, is what I am looking for with this. So go ahead and do that, and you can email that to me if you are out, and just give it back. Give it to me when you come back to class. All right, and that's how we ended class on most of my sections. So key takeaway: the expansion of European maritime empires was met with different responses, different regions of the world. Some states were looking to isolate themselves. Some states will control the flow of ideas, right? Like what happened with mainland China. New labor systems will emerge. Right. All right, and that is all for today. Sapriati.